I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
We are Velocities in Music. On this podcast, Tom and I discuss a caravan of topics pertaining to modern music, including, but as Tom, you know, not limited to artist deep dives and monthly and annual new music wrap-ups. Last episode on Velocities in Music, Tom and I dove into the first 4 albums of the Brit rock icons Blur, one of our favorite bands collectively. Today, we will continue our Blur artist deep dive covering their 1997 self-titled release up to modern times with their most recent release, 2015's The Magic Whip. Before we get started, you can help support Velocities in Music. Subscribe to Velocities in Music on your favorite podcasting device to automatically get our latest episodes sent to your device for your listening pleasure. Also, Velocities in Music does not want your money. We also don't want to introduce any ads into the podcast just yet. Right now, all we want is for you to share Velocities in Music with family or friends whom you think would benefit from joining in on the music discussion Tom and I try to create in every one of these podcasts that we put our heart and soul into. Tom, we left off talking about The Great Escape and how it performed, especially in relation to some of their previous records, and how the image of Blur kind of overnight changed from being the darlings of England to now being kind of this hated band, almost despised in a way.
Yeah, people kind of turned on him because I think that for a lot of people, I don't know, maybe that magic just kind of wore off through the whole feud with Oasis. You're talking about just the kind of disenchantment that people were feeling. And so the band was going through a really hard time through the rest of 95, 96, leading up to their next album, their 5th album, self-titled, which came out in 1997. Leading up to that, the band wasn't getting along too much. There was some friction. They were having a lot of personal problems, struggling with drugs. Alex James, the bass player, was living a very party lifestyle. They were all into drugs. That entire scene.
Graham was drinking
a lot. He was an alcoholic. And it was kind of tearing them apart, and they just didn't really know where to go with it. Well, Graham had turned to actually end up liking a lot of American music, but more the American indie scene. He was big into Pavement, for example.
Which, could you blame him?
No, I mean
Pavement's pretty great.
They're a great band, and Graham had said, I just needed nourishing as a guitarist. Like he was still trying to explore what he could do on guitar, and he decided that he wanted the band to make music that scared people again.
Right, he actually wrote that in a letter to Damon Albarn,
right,
and eventually convinced Damon that they needed to go in a different direction. And I think Damon at one point was quoted saying that he can just sit at the piano and write, the Britpop songs all day long, but at some point you just have to move on.
Yeah.
And you know what? They're totally right. And and I mentioned this in the end of the last podcast, but you could kind of hear the tiredness and in the vocals and just kind of in the instrumentation and the performances of the instrumentation in The Great Escape. Like, it just felt a little bit like they were bored and they weren't quite as creative. They were kind of losing that creative edge that was so present on Modern Life is Rubbish and Park Life. So they had to go in a new direction. Yep. And how would you describe this new direction of self-titled? I mean, is it really grunge?
I don't think so.
I don't think you can call it grunge.
It's noisy.
Yeah, it's indie alternative rock.
Yeah, but I mean, what a move that they made. Alex James described it as a big effing balls move because, after Park Life and The Great Escape, they had attracted a fan base of a lot of like teenage girls, not exclusively, but they were saying like they noticed that's what the front rows were at their concerts, and then they basically turned around and said, "We don't need that. Let's do what we want to do," And so they ended up making their self-titled album, which it is very noisy. It's very aggressive. It's very loud. There's not only the heavy moving guitar parts, but also in like the bass. Song 2. Known as the woohoo song by a lot of people. First off, I actually have to commend them. I appreciate that they actually made song 2 track 2 on the album, because what douchebags they would be if it was like track 3 and they still called it
They'd just be messing with people.
Yeah, I know. Like I would hate them at that point. No.
Yeah.
But like that song, the actually main part that you hear during that heavy instrumental part is mostly the bass. It's just heavily distorted. So they all got behind this kind of aesthetic. Damon Albarn started changing his lyrical approach. It wasn't just about other people now.
It was more just about the Who's.
Yeah.
Woohoo.
About the Who's down in Whoville? What are you talking about? No, I got you. But they decided to go more experimental with it. And despite, once again, taking a very unprecedented, unpredictable change in sound, it ended up being a good move for them. This album went to #1 in the UK again, and it also started to see them get more attention in the US, with Song 2 being a big single, and people starting to pick up a little bit more on what they were doing.
Yeah, opening track Beetlebum, one of my favorite Blur tracks.
Same here, yeah.
And I think it's a little bit longer in length, and while Blur had flirted with the long song a couple of times, most of the time their songs were like 3.5, 4 minutes long. Because they were writing Britpop tunes, pop at its core, which means you're going to have some semblance of a verse and a chorus and some repetition in that formula. No matter how intricate and complex the songwriting did get, the structure remained relatively simple. Mm-hmm. Now you're starting to see them throw that old paradigm away and move towards a more expansive song structure implementation, and Beetlebum is a great example of that. This song really starts off slow and kind of brooding, and then it builds until you have this really, really strong chorus. And that's the thing, is while they increase the edge, they change some things in how they're structuring the songs, they change the level of intensity, and honestly started moving away from, I think, the harmonized vocals. Mm-hmm. They were still able to write extremely emotionally cathartic and appealing choruses that just stick in your head. Like the chorus of Beetlebum is one of the most fantastic songs. I mean, this is just one of the best Blur songs. Period.
And when she lets me slip away, she tells me oh my God, it's gone, nothing is wrong.
But then song 2, I think that this is a song that Graham really gets a lot of credit on. But as you pointed out, like the main riff you hear in the chorus is bass.
Yeah.
But it has a great guitar riff as well. It's just an all-around great song, and it's only 2 minutes long. Unfortunately for me, that song's been kind of ruined because it's the song that, like most people who haven't heard about Blur have heard of song 2. Oh yeah, it's the band that did song 2.
They did that one song. Yeah. They have other songs also.
Damon Albarn, he's that guy from Gorillaz who also did that song 2 song.
Right.
I hate you.
Right. Those are the one moments where I really feel snobby and pretentious about my music enthusiasm. I'm like, screw you for knowing Gorillaz and not Blur.
Yeah.
It's frustrating.
And then the album goes on from there with Country Sad Ballad Man, which is kind of a funky, kind of, I don't know how to describe it, but there's no song in Blur's discography that sounds anything like that sound. And so just through the first 3 tracks of this album, they've really taken you on a journey already into new territory that only bands, kind of like Pavement or some of the other American indie or alternative bands have done before. So this is pretty unprecedented. The trick is throughout the self-titled Blur album, throughout this record, they are coupling that indie alternative lo-fi edge that you get inherently, and they're coupling it with their ability to create crazy pop melodies, crazy pop hooks, and that is where the special sauce is, because Blur can write a hook better than any band out there at the time, and they're able to do it with all this edge as well. So it appealed to this just multitude of listening preferences.
I think you really nailed it there, and that's why. So this is my favorite Blur album. I think this album is an absolute masterpiece. Yeah. There's nothing else like it from Blur. I don't even know what other bands sound remotely like this. The guitar tones, even though they're taking influence from some of these bands that we mentioned, like Pavement, it still doesn't sound like Pavement. And I think that's where you get that creative peak, is where you have the ability to pair experimental presentation and production with just solid rock pop songwriting at its core. Another thing they were doing on this album is they were focusing much more on what they could accomplish just the four of them. And we talked about Great Escape being this very saturated album where you had synth, you had horns, you had additional strings, you had all this stuff. This album, well, it doesn't feel like a stripped back album.
It is.
It is in terms of just the fact that it's focused more on just the four main members of the band. There are still some additional guitar layers, and especially just from the effects that Graham's using on his guitar with the huge distortions and the reverbs and the reverb distortion and all of that fills out the sound. It's still a minimal amount of performances happening at any given point in time. We also see Graham actually, while he's taking a little bit more control of the direction of the band, he also has his first full songwriting credit on here with You're So Great, where he sings lead vocals, just kind of a guitar ballad.
That's one of my track picks. I think it's a wonderful track.
That's probably in my top 5 Blur songs, period.
Oh, wow.
I just find that song to be absolutely gorgeous. But you have this experimentation on here that still feels unified but never really repeats itself. I think Blur were masters of that. Death of a Party is another highlight for me, with just this distorted modulated guitar and this spooky kind of organ type sound going on throughout it.
Should've stayed away another night.
Then into Chinese Bombs, which is like the token thrashy punk song of the album. They tend to do that a lot.
They always have one song on their albums.
On Park Life, it was Bank Holiday.
Yep.
We'll see it on their next couple albums as well. But this album, there's just nothing like it. I think it's an absolute masterpiece.
So when I was listening through this a few nights ago and taking notes over it, which I found it very hard to take notes over this album because I've listened to this one. This is the Blur album I fell in love with, and I remember it was in 2010 when I finally this album really clicked with me, and it's because like with all Blur albums, as I've said before, it's I would argue it's front heavy, but it's not for the first time. That's not because the songs on the back half are really that significantly weaker. It's just that the songs on this album are all fantastic. And there happen to be a number of fantastic tracks in the first half of the record. So in going through this, when I get to track 5, I've like my first 5 track picks are the first 5 songs on the album. I think it's just perfect, a perfect start to this record. Theme from Retro, track 6, is a perfect transitional track, and I really love its placement on this record and really like that track. It's just not a track pick for me. And that's right before You're So Great. So that, like, between Beetlebum and You're So Great, it's perfection for me. Like, they couldn't have done it better. What's interesting is track 4, M.O.R. David Bowie actually has songwriting credits on that song.
Oh, really?
And track 12, Strange News from Another Star, might as well be a David Bowie song.
They say it's no game. There's strange news from another star.
I've thought that as well.
Yeah.
It sounds just like Bowie.
It does.
But the back half of the album, I think you make a great point that a lot of the highlights are on the front part, but it's more just because there is a bit of a stylistic shift in the back half where it gets spacier.
It gets spacier. A little bit more progressive.
Yeah, I'm Just a Killer for Your Love, Strange News from Another Star, and then Essex Dogs, the closing track, which is an 8-minute, just kind of odd, narrated, weird kind of looped thing.
I have a hard time with ending the album that way, especially when you've made such a bold, strong statement up until that point. I kind of wish it would have just ended with track 13 moving on, or maybe like putting Look Inside America at the very end, which I think would have been like a good thesis statement for this record.
I think that would have been a closing good. And Look Inside America is a track pick for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too.
Great song. I actually, while I totally understand where you're coming from, I actually really like Essex Dogs for whatever reason. When it gets to it, I look forward to it, and it's kind of for me a good come down from the blast of the album that came before.
Deep breath after.
Right, right, exactly.
I almost wish, like, I would rather them have ended with Look Inside America and then released Essex Dogs as like a single of some kind, or like a B-side.
Yeah,
because I think it's long enough that it supports that. It's kind of its own unique idea. I just felt like it was just tacked onto the album personally. So that's like my only complaint about this record. The only thing keeping it from being just absolutely perfect for me.
Yeah.
But I still, this is, in my head, I have a really hard time picking which album I like better, this album or Parklife, because for all intents and purposes, it's like two different bands.
Yeah. Might as well. And it was only 3 years apart.
Mm-hmm.
And they had an album between that.
Yeah, that's
crazy. It's crazy.
That is nuts.
Following Self-Titled in 1997, they actually, I'll take a quick stop on Bustin' and Dronin' in 1998, which we're not going to spend much time on. It was kind of a remix album where they let some artists and producers remix their stuff, like Moby, and more importantly, William Orbit, who they really liked his remix that he did of the stuff from Self-Titled, so they picked him to produce their next album. Now, why this is important is because this is the first departure from Stephen Street as a producer.
Right.
Which I actually think it's pretty incredible that they accomplished all they did with Stephen Street, because from Modern Life to Parklife to Great Escape to Self-Titled, think about how much the sound changed so dramatically and so quickly. I think it's really a testament to Stephen Street's production abilities that he was able to keep up with that and do what the band wanted. So following Self-Titled, they once again had great success from that, changed their sound really drastically. And now they're starting to get a little more inward looking when it comes to their music. Damon's not writing these biographical third-person narratives about non-existent fictional characters. He's starting to write about himself. And throughout this time, he went through a really bad breakup with Justine Frischmann, the lead singer and front woman of the British band Elastica. So now all of a sudden you see him have even more reason to get a little more personal with the music. And they're continuing on their album 13, which came out in 1999. They're continuing this kind of trend of noisiness that we saw in Self-Titled,
Sure.
But it's becoming even more disconnected in sorts.
Do you have any idea why they called it 13?
First off, there's 13 songs.
That's logical.
I read somewhere, I don't remember exactly where, that also Graham was using a lot of 13th chords throughout the writing. So I don't know, just kind of an interesting chord structure thing. But on the cover, they also have, they have the 13, but it kind of looks like a B also for Blur.
The cover is actually a Graham Coxon painting.
It is, yep. So he has a heavy hand in this one, even more so than Self-Titled. They go in this really kind of crazy experimental direction. But what I think is really interesting about this album is where even when they shifted their sound into Self-Titled to be a little more abrasive, you mentioned, Jake, there's still a lot of just great pop songwriting underneath that.
Yeah.
13 is more an album that's less focused on pop songwriting, and the construction of the album was more an editing process for them. They had these long extended jams, and they just kind of sat down with William Orbit and pieced them together into songs.
Jam is the key word. This album, jam is the shift that you've never really saw there before. I guess there were elements of that, even going back as far as Leisure is you heard that the band was capable of jamming. I think at one point they even did a fade out ending there, but this album, the track lengths, a couple of the track lengths just start going through the roof. You have several 7.5 minute songs on this record.
3 of them.
This is, I think, the longest Blur record to date at 1 hour and 6 minutes in length. That's a long record.
It is. Yeah.
66 minutes is a long time. And I kind of like The Great Escape. I have a tendency to I really struggle picking selected tracks to just cut from the record.
Yeah.
But I also feel like this album is unjustifiably long. And I'm not quite sure. I haven't quite put my finger on exactly why. Maybe through talking through it with you, Tom, I'll discover that. But I do feel like the last track on this record, Optigan, could have maybe you could have just ended with the really great single that they had from this record, No Distance Left to Run, which is just this really heartfelt electric guitar ballad. It's probably the simplest song on the album. I would say it's just very straightforward.
And I totally see where you're coming from, but I'm going to disagree with you there.
Fine.
This is an album that I have to gush over. I think it's an absolutely overlooked masterpiece.
Definitely Blur's most underrated record. I think
sure.
The Great Escape was underrated, but this is significantly underrated.
Yeah, I never hear folks talking about this. And admittedly, it's my kind of album. It's noisy, but it's got great songwriting. It's got a lot of adventurous guitar playing.
Yes, very great instrumentation.
And where I feel this album, though, for me, they're darkest. But there's still some great melodies on here. Coffee and
Tom,
TV was a good hit.
You like dark music?
What do you know?
That's surprising.
They even brought back an old demo from 1992 with track 5, which is called 1992, which I think that is a good song to highlight because it shows the change that they'd gone through in these intervening 7 years. This song is a demo that Damon had discovered from, between Leisure and A Modern Life is Rubbish. But then they brought back for this. And when you listen to the melody, it sounds like something that would make sense on Modern Life is Rubbish at its core.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, if you held a Nerf gun to my head and asked me to like pick a track to remove from that album, it'd be 1992.
Oh, really?
Or the last track.
Okay, that's fair.
Or both.
See, so
you could afford to lose both.
So what they do here though is they take this track and where at its melodic core it sounds like their older stuff. That's what makes it such a good reference point of what they're doing now, because this song gets scary and noisy by the end.
And you'd love my bed. You got the other instead.
And not at all what they would have done if they'd released it in 92 or 93, where it would have turned out more like something like Blue Jeans or Peach.
It's like you hear the growth of the band
throughout
the song. Well, now you're convincing me to keep it on the album.
Well, I was going to say,
lower your Nerf gun.
This is an album that even at 66 minutes, it's a rare album that for me, I wouldn't change a freaking thing. Even like songs like Caramel and Coffee and TV have these like jams at the beginning or end of them that are it's like they just cut in some part of their jam session that they didn't want to make into a full song. Which a lot of the time I would disagree with that choice, but this album is extremely moving to me, and just a powerful listen because it sounds like guys going through a mess personally, and it's almost just this abstract musical statement.
Well, 2 songs on here are directly related to Damon's breakup with Justine, and that's Tender, the first track, which I'll have you speak to. It's 7 minutes and 40 seconds. That is one of those Blur anthems I talked about in the previous podcast. That it has to be one of their most well-known and well-executed songs.
It's one of my favorite songs of theirs. Another top 5 for me.
Lord, I need to find someone who can heal my mind. Come on, come on, come on. Get through it. Come on, come on, come on. Love's the great.
Yeah, and then also No Distance Left to Run would be the other breakup song.
Yep.
But that's not all on this album. Like this album has so much just cathartic expression in the lyrics and the vocals, but honestly in the instrumentation performances, if you listen closely as well, there's all this emotional subtext going on between this really loud, raunchy, distorted, experimental sound that was just slathered on top of what is really a quite sad and dark record, as to use the words you said earlier. And I think that's what makes this album kind of hard to take in. It's probably the most inaccessible Blur album,
100%.
But yet probably one of the most rewarding if you really dig at it and pick all the sonic elements apart and try to understand what's like how they compose this thing.
This one took a long time to click with me. Like I said, this was one that I didn't really start listening to until I was in college, and I was like, what the hell is this? But more I listened to it, the more I realized that it's quirky. What seems like imperfections at first are really all part of the experience. You go from Tinder into Bugman, which Tinder is this acoustic, big gospel-inspired song of empowerment and recovery. And then Bugman starts with the absolute raunchiest guitar sound you've ever heard, the loosest just fuzz clang of Graham Coxon's guitar.
And what I love about Bugman is the distortion that coats everything it actually does remind you of a bug buzzing around your head.
It does.
And
I never thought of that.
The fact that they were able to accomplish that, yet still make a song that is really fun to listen to. I mean, that's a track pick of mine from this record. Coffee and TV, track 3 on this record, you know, it has that upbeat kind of poppy Blur chorus, but it's so thickly distorted and it has kind of a unique sound to it. This has become my ultimate pre-concert song, and that's just because so many concerts, whether it's up at First Ave in Minneapolis or in smaller venues like around Iowa that we've been to, they play this song before concerts. And I love that about like the places that we go, because to me it's just like this perfect kind of like rock out warm up song that it just gets me jacked for music. So that's probably my favorite song on the album, mostly because I associate it with some of the awesome concerts we've been to.
So I'm gonna defend real quick the closing track, Optigan 1.
Please do.
So here's my thoughts on it, because I see where you're coming from. It's just this kind of 2.5 minute weird kind of like organ sounding, like telephone EQ'd, like kind of fuzzy thing. The thing that I love about it is, to me, similar to what I said about Essex Dogs on Self-Titled, it's the come down. You just finished No Distance Left to Run, which is this heart-wrenching, soul-bearing confession of Damon Albarn, something that you've almost never gotten from him on any other album. And then I feel like Optigan 1 is after you've taken the antidepressant with a swill of whiskey to wash it down, and it's like you've just completely numbed yourself of emotion, and it's just this like kind of like fake cheery kind of organ part that's just masked through this like this wall, and then the album closes out. So like, to me, it's actually like quite chilling.
Well, when you put
reason.
it like that, it makes sense to keep it. But to me, like I always want albums to end with a statement, and I think No Distance Left to Run really, like, it's a statement just in the fact that its composition contrasts itself so much with the rest of the material on the record, that returning to anything that sounds remotely like the material that came before No Distance Left to Run doesn't really make logical sense to me. So I'd rather just cut it clean there. But now I'm gonna have to go back and listen to it with that in mind, and my whole opinion might change. Which is what I love. No, this is what I love about Blur, is that there's always different ways of the songwriting is so intricate and so deep that there's always different ways to listen to this to their albums and interpret the underlying meaning, the emotional appeal, and the underlying rational appeal that each of these albums and all of their songs convey. And I think that that's what makes this such a special band, and most of these albums that we're talking about in these two podcasts so special, is and why I think I could never argue with you for this being your favorite band, because they do stuff like this, and they get us talking about music and you know, in very detailed passionate ways. You know,
one song I gotta highlight before we move on from 13 is track 7, Battle.
Track pick for you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, me too.
That song, just this, like, you know, that kind of spooky high-end melody, and then the drums come in, and Dave Rowntree is nailing the snare on those triplets, and there's just this huge distorted bass wash.
Actually, it kind of makes sense that you love that song, because it's a lot like the music you write.
Right. Well, that's
the thing I really like about that track is first of all, to me, that's just probably the most experimental that this band gets on this record, and that song is very kind of almost like dream pop at times. But what I love about that song, and I think that it takes an extremely good band from a songwriting perspective to be able to pull this off. This song is 7 minutes and 43 seconds long, and I can listen to the entire thing without going, yeah, they should have shortened this up. It's jammy, and it sprawls, and it totally justifies every second of the song, and that takes a band that is able, that their level of their craft is so high at this point that's just it's indicative of just a band at the top of their game. And so I really like when I hear Battle, it's the song that makes me go, yeah, like Blur is the best. They're the best. Like there's very few bands out there that can do what Blur do at the 13 once they released 13.
And this is still, this is their 7th album, and it came out 8 years after their debut.
Yeah.
No, it's their 6th album.
Yeah.
Sorry. It's their 6th album. It came out 8 years after their debut. And think about the change they'd gone through, the evolution. Like it blows my mind.
I just realized we've never really talked about this album before.
No, we haven't. But
it was fun.
I tell you, it's continued to climb the ranks for me.
Yeah. I could see that.
And we'll talk about our favorites later. But while we're talking about 13, the 3 albums of theirs that I grew up with, Modern Life is Rubbish, Park Life, and Self-Titled, I always kind of thought those 3 would be impossible to crack as my top 3 Blur albums. But 13 has done it. Like it's up there for me. It's just such a singular experience. I don't get that from anywhere else.
So as we move on from Blur's 6th record, 13. 6th record, right? You said 7th earlier now. So as we move on from Blur's 6th record, 13, I think it's important to go back to Damon Albarn, when he and Justine broke up, they had just taken this trip, and I don't really care about the details of this, but their relationship was falling apart, and they had been together for several years. It was a very tough thing for Damon, and wrote a couple songs on it that certainly were some of the strongest songs on 13 and contributed to the overall mood and emotional state that is presented on that record. Once he and Justine broke up, he moved out of wherever he was living with Justine and got an apartment, or a flat as they call it, with Jamie Hewlett, who was some sort of animation guy. I really don't know a lot about Jamie Hewlett other than he's one of the founding members of Gorillaz. So there was some rumors circulating at the time that Damon had this side project going on, which it turned out to be true, and this was Gorillaz. In 2001, Gorillaz released their first album. Now, eventually, Tom and I want to do a Gorillaz deep dive. There's rumors that there may be a new Gorillaz album coming out.
They just released a new song.
Yeah. So we might hold off until then. So we're not going to dive into all the Gorillaz record here, but I promise someday we will do a Gorillaz deep dive because it's one of Tom and my favorite bands. But Gorillaz dropped and obviously just a huge record. What a stunning success. Clint Eastwood, the main single from that record, it shook America. Yeah. And Blur finally became Gorillaz became very popular in America, and now from Self-Titled and Gorillaz, Damon Albarn really had this like American presence all of a sudden. But then Blur goes back into the studio and they start getting ready to make their next album.
Yep, and that was they start getting ready to make Think Tank in around 2002, which will be released in 2003, but there was still a lot of friction within the band. I think that things for Alex and Dave had kind of leveled out a bit. Dave,
they had all gotten into different types of music. They were really going in different directions.
People, yeah.
Yeah, Graham had released, I think, several solo records by that point. And obviously Damon was doing his own thing with Gorillaz. It just, like, these guys were all coming from different places in their life. And as you see with any band, like that seems to be like one common theme of when we do these deep dives of these really, really iconic, successful artists like the Beatles or the Smiths or any big artist is as they grow as people throughout these experiences, like becoming a majorly successful rock band takes you around the world.
Yeah.
You're going to meet people. You're going to have life experiences that most people don't have. And those life experiences change who you are fundamentally as a human being. And the people that you start off being when you start your band, those like just a few years into this, yes, only like 8 or 9 years transpired between these events, now 10 at this point, in the case of Blur, but these are very different people than the band that got together onto a record deal and released Leisure. So a lot of change had occurred in that time. And so understandably, there was some tension in the studio.
And they all had their own personal problems as well. Graham, shortly before going to the studio, he was in rehab for his alcoholism for, I want to say, about a month. And I don't think that the rest of the band really knew exactly what was going on, but he wasn't really showing up to the studio because of that. He had his own personal things to take care of. And then, in Graham's words, he thinks, when he did get there, he was probably a bit of a crap to be around. He, was probably irritable. He was just kind of a down guy because it was a rough time in his life. And I think that Damon wasn't hugely tolerant of that, because the way Damon saw it is he's like, I wanted to put Blur on hold. I just had huge success with Gorillaz, and that was kind of my new main focus, but I had committed to putting out another Blur album, so by God, I was going to see through that commitment. And I think he just saw Graham as getting kind of in the way of that and not really respecting that commitment. So, in I'm sure what were some high emotions and probably some miscommunications as well, they kind of end up softly booting Graham from the band, and he kind of left on his own accord.
I think they actually went to the manager and asked their manager to let him go, which that had to be such a hard thing to do, especially after the last two records, which were so heavily influenced by Graham.
They were huge Graham albums, and now all of a sudden it's just Damon, Alex, and Dave. But I still think what they put together with Think Tank is pretty incredible. Now, a couple things to note about Think Tank and how it's different. First off, no Graham. I mean, he shows up a little bit on the very last track, Battery in Your Leg, but it's not a very huge contribution. So they have to compensate for that. They have to find somewhere else to go with their sound. Also, they recorded a lot of it in Morocco, and the culture there of, the musicians just being more kind of street musicians, not focusing on crafting these big complex songs and just playing out in the streets about little everyday things, really helped to inspire Damon and just show, we can do this on more of a kind of on the fly way and be inspired by what's around us rather than trying to think so hard about what we're writing about. From there also...
That sounds like the kiss of death.
Right. Well, from there also, there was a different producer, Ben Hillier, which they also then brought in other producers to work with them. They had some work done with, I think, like the Dust Brothers and some other folks that they didn't even end up using. But they did end up doing a couple songs with Fatboy Slim, produced 2 tracks, as well as William Orbit produced 1 track. So the production, for that reason, is a little less consistent than what we get on earlier Blur albums, but it also kind of creates this smorgasbord of tracks, which is really what Think Tank is.
And that's my biggest complaint about it. I actually, I find that just fundamentally there isn't a lot of bad material on this record, but there isn't a lot of really superb standout material on this record either. It's kind of middle of the road, but if a lot of Blur's previous songs I would classify as like in the A minus range, this would be more like B, mid B range. So not quite like average, but it's still very above average. It's just different for Blur.
Yeah.
The other thing is because of what you just pointed out, using different their approach to writing these songs and using different producers as well. I want to say that this is a weaker album, yet I love a lot of these tracks, and I think that the tracks tend to stand on their own and don't rely on the product of the full album listen, which makes this album listen kind of lack cohesion, and that's for something sure. I definitely look for when really, like, how much do I love this as an album? Well, I love a lot of the tracks, but I don't necessarily love the album itself. And the other thing is, and I'll get into this later, but I also think that, like all Blur albums, this is front heavy and a little bit too long, too unjustifiably long.
Yeah, that's fair. I think that this album was more about the sounds than the songwriting.
Yeah, and it's very easy to tell. I mean, this sounds kind of like the second Gorillaz record.
It might as well have been in a lot of ways. I mean, not that Dave and Alex didn't contribute, because I feel like it sounds like Gorillaz with more of a focus on drums and bass. Yeah. Well, that kind of makes sense because you have the main songwriter of Gorillaz with a bass player and drummer that he's spent his whole musical career playing with. Of course, there's a lack of guitar because Graham's not there. But, I would even say to a degree, you could say that 13 was an album that was more about sound than it was songwriting. But
the underlying songwriting was
songwriting was there more so than it was on here.
Absolutely.
Also, this is just more about sound craft, which you could tell Damon had honed working with Dan the Automator on the first Gorillaz album, and a lot of the beat production and approach to the arrangements feels like Gorillaz,
and
for
that's
sure.
the main difference is from 13 to Think Tank is you have a heavy use of sampled rhythm loops. You have lots of big, thick electronic sounds and other sound effects and samples in the mix. They played with this stuff before, but it was all supplemental. Now those two elements really take the forefront in every one of these songs. You still have the instrumentation, but it's not quite it's like an even mix where it was just supplemental before. And that's a significant shift in sound for these guys, and one that feels a bit foreign. Like you can kind of tell if Graham had been there, it wouldn't have been that way. If you listen to the last track on the album, Battery in Your Leg, that's the song with the strongest guitar melody, and honestly, it's a wonderful, weird, and morose guitar melody that's very evocative, and honestly, probably one of the strongest songs on the record because of it. I feel like when I listen to this, I kind of wish Graham had been there because it doesn't feel like a Blur record to me. Now, that said, I still love a lot of these tracks. Ambulance, the first track, sounds like Gorillaz. The guitar and bass groove there, spectacular. Out of Time. I'm not going to use the word that I have written here, but I think something that it points out is there's a really good vocal presentation in that song. And I think, Tom, we were talking about this earlier. Think Tank of any Blur record, and maybe because Graham isn't there, Think Tank succeeds for Damon as a vocalist because he had to compensate for not having Graham there.
Yeah, he really had to step up his game. I think his vocal performances were great, and his vocal writing. The thing is, we mentioned this album being more about the sound than the songwriting, and I think that's 100% true. However, I have to give it to Damon. While the songwriting is minimalistic, it's still powerful. It's still potent. I would call out track 5 on The Way to the Club, which is just kind of this driving beat with Damon's kind of ghostly melody on top of it. And it's a very simple melody, but it's a beautiful melody. I could listen to just an a cappella version of him singing that track, and I would still love it. The track before it, Good Song, track 4, is one of my favorite Blur songs. And that's just a nice repeated kind of guitar loop and beat. But then Damon's melody, again, very simple, but he performs it really well, and it's mixed very well.
The country got a hold of my soul. TV's dead, and there ain't no war in my head now. And you seem very.
This album, I think it's hard to say this is one of the stronger Blur albums, just because it doesn't feel like a band. But one thing I think it does accomplish is it feels very fresh. They still, once again, were able to change their sound. Now, maybe it's closer to Gorillaz than it is what we've come to love from Blur, but I still think it succeeds on that level because it sounds fresh. They're not restating anything they've ever done before, and there are just some good highlights on here.
So one of the things I would have changed on this record just to make it a bit more cohesive and not more justified in length, because it's pretty long. I really like track 10, Sweet Song.
I agree.
It's a very sweet song. You know, you have the piano, acoustic guitar, a little bit of electronic synth there. It's just it's aptly named. I would have gone straight from that into Battery in Your Leg. I would have skipped track 11 and 12, just not put those on the album. Jets and Gene by Gene. Jets is the longest song on the album, almost 6.5 minutes long. It's very experimental, has a Gorillaz vibe, big bass, it's moody, it's playful, but does it really justify that track length? Probably not. Yeah. And then Gene by Gene is another very experimental Gorillaz-based sounding track, and I just think that both of those tracks, like in the Think Tank sessions, these guys recorded a ton of material.
Yeah.
And it was very clear that they just patched an album together out of that material. Well, they could have narrowed it down even farther. I think that at some point they just said, all right, we're done. And they didn't think through some of that. And that's pretty honestly typical of Blur throughout their discography, is that each album there's songs that I'll go, I could probably see that if that wasn't on this record. So I would have liked it had they just skipped those two tracks. It would have felt a lot more impactful.
Yeah. I can't argue with that.
Thanks. I mean, on 13, you made some great points.
No, it's fair. Well, it's interesting. You know, this is a band that we both really love, but we experience them very differently.
Yeah.
So it's cool to see.
Well, it's funny thinking. Because like you got me listening to this band kind of in a similar way with like the big 3 albums to start with, but then organically discovering the other ones. So I kind of had a similar experience to you did, just like years later in my life, in discovering and falling in love with each of these different records in a different way.
Yeah. So following Think Tank. Moving on from 2003, they went on a short tour with where they, oh man, it like pains me to say this, they replaced Graham with Simon Tong from The Verve.
Ooh.
But they did some shows, and I don't think they enjoyed it very well, which like, man, if you're a Blur fan, do you really want to go see Blur without Graham? See, with some other guy playing Graham's guitar parts? There's no one like Graham.
Yeah, it's like cheating on your girlfriend.
Right, it's not, it just seems wrong to me. You know, they did that, and then after that, it was just kind of, that was it. They were all doing their own different things. Graham was still doing some solo stuff. Damon was having a lot of success with Gorillaz. You know, the second Gorillaz album, Demon Days, came out in 2005. So that was going on. I think Dave tried to like kick his cocaine habit and started going into like business and politics. And then Alex kind of retired back to the country and became a cheese maker. Yeah. That's an interesting direction to take. But they all kind of settled out then, and then, you know, obviously a lot of time in between, but then in around 2009, they ended up getting back together and playing some shows. Graham and Damon had patched up the ill feelings that were existing between them. So they ended up headlining some festival spots, playing in Hyde Park, and kind of rekindling the fire that they once had. So they did some more shows. A few years later, they put out new tracks, Under the Westway and The Puritan, which I remember, you know, that was only 5 years ago at this point, and I remember when those came out, and I was like, oh my gosh, are they going to put out a new album? They're going to put out a new album?
Yeah, I remember you being very excited.
It was such a tease, because those were pretty good tracks. Under the Westway is a little bit more of a ballad, but it just showed promise that they were back together doing anything, right? But then nothing really happened, and they kept everything pretty secret. Well, then early 2015, what do you know? They put out a single and announced that they have a new album coming out just a couple months after that in spring of 2015, and that's when we ended up getting The Magic Whip. So The Magic Whip is once again a pretty different kind of Blur album, but it feels like Blur again because Graham is back in the band. This was recorded primarily in Hong Kong, and really what happened was a couple of years before it was released, when they were doing some recordings and playing some tours, they were supposed to have a short tour in Japan that ended up getting canceled. So they retreated to the studio in Hong Kong for just about 5 days and just recorded all day, each day that they were there. Came up with a bunch of material that they felt was really fresh, but then afterwards they didn't really end up doing anything with it. It actually was Graham who ended up going back to Damon and saying, hey, you know, I really would love to take a crack at this stuff that we recorded back in Hong Kong. is that all right? Do you mind if I work with a producer and just go through that? And they ended up picking Stephen Street again, bringing him back for the first work that they'd done with him since 1997's self-titled album. So Damon loved the idea. So did Alex and Dave. Graham took it upon himself to take the time to sift through these jams, almost kind of the editing process similar to what they did with 13, but with a very different kind of sound. This was a very sharp sounding urban album.
Yep.
A lot of more electronic sounds. You look at the studio setup that they had, and they're all crammed in this tight little room. Dave with a very minimalistic drum set because there just wasn't the space. Damon's kind of sitting there with these synthesizers and keyboards, and Graham's sitting there with his guitar. Like a very organic way of making music, but also for a very modern album.
Modern, keyword there. This album is really heavily electronic for Blur, even compared to Think Tank, I think. While it is that full band Blur sound, also very, very electronic for the band. These songs are all rock songs at their core, but they are embellished with these electronic keys and synths, especially in the bridges, which are prevalent on a lot of the tracks. And that fills the sound, and it also gives it this cold, almost digital atmosphere.
Yeah.
Kind of perfect for like the album cover itself with the neon lights and the ice cream cone. And then also just thinking about it, was recorded in Hong Kong, and they were kind of watching the city from their hotel room,
yeah.
right? The other thing that really sticks with me about the Magic Whip is the Damon Albarn's vocals, which are beautiful here. His voice at this point is masterful level.
Mm-hmm.
But his lyrical themes are just drivel, and they incorporate these feelings of isolation and alienation and loneliness. I mean, this is a depressing record for me to listen to.
See, I think that's interesting because it's not for me at all.
Oh man. And I think it's Damon, and this comes down to fundamentally like how I enter music and you enter music is different, because the instrumentation, especially the guitars, are not depressing in their presentation, but the vocals absolutely are.
Yeah.
And just because that's how I enter music, I think that's why I feel that way.
That makes a lot of sense. If you're entering it, if you're approaching it from the lyrical perspective, then that's definitely true. And the reason for that is because Damon went back kind of on his own and recorded the vocals after Graham had kind of put together what the tracks would be. And he's just kind of exploring Hong Kong on his own in this whole, just very densely populated world of people that he couldn't quite understand, couldn't quite connect with. That's where tracks like Thought I Was a Spaceman came from. He just felt like not only was he a foreigner from another country, but he might as well have been from another planet because of how disconnected he felt from his surroundings while he was in Hong Kong. Same thing with Pyongyang. He actually went over and visited that city and just wrote about the experiences he had there. So you're definitely right that there's a sense of this kind of physical but also spiritual isolation on this album, and that's directly as a result of what Damon was going through when he was writing it. I think the reason it, and I don't know, this isn't really quite as objective, but I think that part of the reason that doesn't come through quite as strongly in the music is first off, you're absolutely right. The instrumentals help to kind of counterbalance that to a degree because they're bright. They have a pop sheen to them. They're a little bit more optimistic sounding, whereas the vocals are a little more nihilistic or pessimistic.
And the song structuring is it's definitely a strong shift back to the pop format.
Yeah, that's definitely true. So that kind of helps it as well. But also, I think this more reflected the experience Damon was having while recording it, not necessarily his life experience at the time. We got a lot of just kind of devastating stuff from his breakup with Justine on 13. And here it's more kind of quick, immediate observation. But still, what he's done a tremendous job of that he wasn't able to do at the beginning of his career is right through his own eyes, is right about his own experiences in a way that other people can connect to. The fact that resonates with you that way and it has that effect is kind of a testament to his ability as a writer and as a performer. Right. I think he does a great job on this one.
Right. Another thing that really impresses me about the Magic Whip is this album really is able to cover a lot of Blur's past songs and somewhat Gorillaz too, but it doesn't shy away from incorporating like any of the styles that they did that any of the artists have done in their solo work. Gorillaz or Damon Albarn's, like in 2014 he came out with Everyday Robots, and I certainly see some similarities between the Magic Whip and Everyday Robots, and then stuff that references all the way back to their Britpop days. So you hear a lot of that. This is kind of like how Metallica's Hardwired to Self-Destruct harken back to all ages of Metallica fans and all the different types of Metallica fans. This album for Blur does effectively the same thing. It serves, I feel like any Blur fan that they collected over the ages that they existed can relate to this record in some sense.
Which is why I'm kind of surprised that people weren't raving about this one more than they were.
A colder reception than I thought it would.
I don't think anyone hated it, but like, it certainly, I think we were probably one of the only people who had it on our year-end list.
Oh, we loved it.
Yeah, I absolutely loved it. I feel like for any Blur fan, it makes sense. It took me a while to warm up to, because once again, it's different.
Yeah,
that's what I love about it.
I will say this one hasn't stuck with me like I thought it would. I really loved it in 2015 and came back to it numerous times throughout the year, obviously for this podcast. But then I haven't come back to it as much, and I think that part of that has nothing to do with the music, just that there's all these other Blur albums that I want to listen to as well, and they're going to draw me in.
I agree. I feel myself going back to their classic stuff more often, but this is an album I come back to less for the entire album and more for select tracks.
Speaking of which, do you have some favorites?
I do. Lonesome Street.
So, question on this one. I have a theory.
Okay.
And I want to know if you think this, do you think this theory is sound?
I'm interested.
Sound, all right? Lonesome Street. Obviously they mentioned Lonesome Street in the lyrics, but I'm wondering if like they wrote this song because poor Stephen Street had been lonely since 1997, not having worked with Blur, and then now he has to come back and work with Blur. The first song on the record is Lonesome Street, and I think this is Blur's best produced album. The production on this record is great. Immaculate. Yeah. Everything sounds full and lush and pristine and detailed. I love it. So of course it makes sense that they would dedicate the first song on the record to lonely little Steve.
I never would have made that connection, but it's funny now that you say it like that. Like Lonesome Street, we're bringing him as if he was sitting twiddling his thumbs for like 15 years waiting to have something to do.
It's not like the Smiths were doing anything.
They sure as hell weren't. That is a fun theory. For me, Lonesome Street is a highlight though. It's Agreed. A greatly constructed song. They have the chorus that drops in, and the structure is just kind of neat.
You'll have to go on the underground to get things done here. And then you are in your yellow cup, the service done.
I love track 3, Go Out.
I do too.
The first single from the album. I listen to that on repeat in anticipation for this. It does. Noisy ass guitar, lots of effects on it. Kind of an ambivalent, sedated performance from Damon that works perfectly.
Into my bed, do it to myself. To the local.
Another one of my favorites is track 7, My Terracotta Heart.
I love that song too. That song doesn't get a lot of buzz, but I think it's very, very well done. I think Damon Albarn's vocal part in that actually it's very emotive for me.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And Graham's guitar, just kind of moving, winding guitar part through Damon's vocals. I think that's great.
I'm running out of heart today. I'm running out of open roads in you, and I know you are the motive and your day.
I think we talked about this back in 2015 when we covered this record, but Ice Cream Man is a track highlight for me. I love that little electronic melody flurry thing. But just kind of a fun song that just gets my head moving. I really like that song as well.
Here comes the ice cream man bouncing up the hill with a wick, the pumpkin lit, Happy Valley cones he filled.
The back half of this record, like all Blur albums, I think has some fat that it could have been cut.
True.
But I honestly a couple of these songs. Pyongyang, I think, has a strong Bowie vibe. I think Mirrorball could have been on 2016's Black Star, the closing track there.
Yeah.
Maybe you could argue that those tracks. I don't really like being in this business of picking tracks to remove, because like the problem that I have on every Blur album is I like all the songs, so it's really hard to cut them. But they are superfluous to some extent and redundant to some extent. So it does just lengthen the album. This album, though, it's only 51 or 52 minutes long, which really isn't that bad. So I feel like it's less insulting here. But still, to me, the Magic Whip is not one of the strongest Blur albums, but it's really good throughout. It's also I hope it's not the last thing they do.
I hope not also. And that brings me to my question, Jake. I'm going to put you on the spot.
Okay.
Where would you like to see Blur go from here?
Ooh, that's tough.
It is tough because not to answer before you do, but they continue to surprise.
Yeah.
That's their MO. That's what's made them an interesting band. So I would love to keep being surprised, but how?
Yeah, how? Well, I can tell you, and this is kind of a BS answer, because I honestly, I feel this about most popular bands right now, most of my favorite bands, honestly, and that's like, we are so over digitized in 2017. Put down the damn phones, the laptops, GarageBand. You don't need the sound effects. Let's get back to some real down-to-earth acoustic songwriting. I'd like to see more use of acoustic guitar. In fact, some of Blur's best songs strongly use acoustic guitar. I'd like to see more use of that. I'd like to see just focus on like the bigger chorus and honestly let Graham do Graham's thing and have some like guitar, some really great guitar work. I think if like they kind of, I'm not saying go back to the basics as far as like Brit rock, but focus on like their modern sound and present it in a new way with some more aggressive songwriting using acoustic instruments. I think that would actually sound really good, and it would kind of be like a throwback sound that's ahead of its time somehow.
I like that idea. I would like to see them incorporate some more of the stuff they were doing on Self-Titled and 13 and kind of get noisy again. I think that there's room for that in music today. You get a lot of... Today, I feel like there's a lot of guitarists that are nice and heavy, but not creatively abrasive and noisy in the way that Graham Coxon is. So I would like to see him take charge on that. But then, have Damon come in and polish it up a little bit more.
So, put you on the spot.
Yeah.
Please, for us, rank the Blur albums.
All right. My favorite... So, like I said, they've got 4 albums that I would consider to be masterpiece level. For me, those are, in order of which I like them, Self-Titled, Modern Life is Rubbish, 13, and Park Life. While Park Life is my least favorite of those 4, I still consider it to be a perfect album. I mean, they're all on the same level to me. They're all A+. From there, I would go with Great Escape as probably an A-. Think Tank as a B+. I would probably put Magic Whip in the same category as Think Tank. And then Leisure is, it's all right. It's probably like a B-, C+ for me.
Okay. Yeah, I'm a little different, honestly. So Park Life, I think, is a masterpiece. And after I got into Self-Titled, I got into Park Life. Those 2 albums, just for me, are the best Blur albums. And so like I would give those both A+. And it's really hard for me to pick one over the other because they're so different. I mean, if you held that Nerf gun, if you got that Nerf gun out again and held it to my head, Tom, I'd probably pick Self-Titled, but I'm not. Yeah. Depends kind of on my mood too.
Sure.
So after that, it's like another tier. You got Modern Life is Rubbish, The Great Escape, and 13 kind of in there somewhere in a certain order, and I'd say that order flops around for me. Okay. Modern Life is Rubbish I'd probably favor over The Great Escape and 13, but 13 certainly on the rise for all the reasons that we talked about. After that, Think Tank and the Magic Whip are somewhere around there, around the same level, and then Leisure I like significantly less, but still think it's a pretty solid record.
Yeah,
overall, it's just not very in depth,
Yeah.
So got all-time favorite Blur song.
All time, probably Tinder.
Tender?
Yeah. Yeah, I know yours is End of a Century.
End of a Century.
So I want to close before we wrap it up, Jake. I want to give some parting thoughts. I want your thoughts on this because in preparing for this podcast, I've been thinking a lot about why I like this band so darn much.
Yeah.
Right. they're my favorite band, and I think that's a big claim, and I need to be able to back that up. And I'm constantly questioning myself. It's just the nature of who I am as a person. I'm constantly questioning myself and my own beliefs because I feel like it's a healthy exercise, right? You either find out that you were wrong about something, or you reaffirm why you were right about something.
And most of the time, I find being wrong to be more rewarding than being right.
It's true, but if you find that you're right about something, it's good to know why, right? So I was thinking, why do I consider Blur to be my favorite band? You know, that's not a band that I really hear a lot of people talking about. I don't feel like it's just the hipster in me. I don't feel like it's just the sentimental side that I grew up with some of their stuff.
I would never call you a hipster.
So I appreciate
You're
that.
kind of altruistic at times.
Okay. All right. Well, that's nice. I appreciate that. So I was thinking, well, what is it? And I think I came up with a good answer. So first off, there's just this simple observation of quality and diversity in their music. They have so much good music that is so different from each other. That in itself is a huge accomplishment. But for me, a bigger part of it is that, a lot of my favorite bands like Radiohead, I had to say it.
I was trying not to say it this whole podcast.
I had to.
This whole podcast.
It's relevant.
I just want to say in the first half of this, I didn't use the R word once, and I tried really hard not to during Think Tank, and I even had it in my notes. I was like, nope, I'm not going to say it. I'm going to walk away.
Okay. No,
you had to bring it up.
It's because it's relevant. It's relevant to this conversation. But I'm not going to get into detail with it. But them, Metallica, Nine Inch Nails, Tool, even newer bands like The National and Arcade Fire. These are some of my favorite bands, right? But what I noticed about preparing for the deep dive, when you and I just binge on an artist, right, is that Blur is not taxing for me to listen to.
No, I completely agree with that.
I could listen to them all day, every day, and after a while I'd get bored with them just because I'd want to listen to something else, but I wouldn't feel drained. It doesn't wear on me.
Metallica was work for me to get through.
All those other bands do that. As good as they are, all those other bands do that. And so that got me thinking, well, why is that? And I think the reason is that Blur is very much a thinking person's pop band. Mm-hmm. They're a pop band that's accessible, but where they defy a lot of pop tradition is that they're highly intellectual about the way they approach music. In
a way that artists like the Beatles or Bowie were.
Yeah, 100%.
Right.
And the Beatles is the closest comparison in that regard that I could make. All the other bands I named, as much as I love them, they're much more writing for themselves.
Yeah.
Tom York, James Hetfield, Win Butler, all these people, they write music as a means of personal catharsis. And I can respect that because that's how I write music, right? I write music for myself. So I'd be a hypocrite to say that that's bad, but what it becomes is it becomes emotionally taxing. Right? There's a lot of bands out there that, as great as they are, you listen to them and you're like, holy crap, if I listen to another one of these albums, I'm going to lose it. We experienced that with Ween, as much as we love that deep dive. Yeah, absolutely. Like it just becomes taxing. With Blur, it is the opposite for me. When I put on Blur, it is soul replenishing. It is revitalizing in a way that even my other favorite bands, they actually take that down for me. I have to spend my emotional currency to listen to them. Blur actually builds me back up. In the same way, that's the reason I prefer Paul McCartney's solo work to John Lennon's solo work. John Lennon is brilliant. You put on Plastic Ono Band and it's brilliant, but God, by the end of that album, you don't want to talk to anyone for the rest of the day. It's heavy and it's hard to get through, and I'm attracted to that kind of music, but it's good to have something that brings you back up to a zero balance, right? And that's what Blur does for me in the same way that Paul McCartney's solo stuff is. And I think that another thing that it comes down to for them is that Blur always write music for the sake of making good music. Even in albums like 13, which is their probably heaviest and darkest album and sees Damon tackling some of his own personal issues, even on songs like Tender and No Distance Left to Run, where he's dealing with a breakup, he's doing it in a way that always has the music as the end result in mind rather than just his own emotional well-being. I can't say that about most other bands. Most other bands write for themselves. Right. And I understand that. I'm guilty of it as well. But that's why I always come back to Blur, is because I feel like they're always thinking of me and the output of what they're making from a listener's ears rather than just for themselves.
Very well said. Very well said.
Makes sense?
Yeah, and
Okay.
I can relate to that. These guys, and I think that part of it is just like how I listen to music as well. These guys don't trigger my the feels as much
Sure.
for me. So it is a very heady experience when I'm listening to this band. Honestly similar to Metallica. Like I
Sure.
think Metallica is a very heady band. I mean, you absorb so much through just the technicality of what they're doing, right?
Yeah.
And Blur is kind of like that as well, just with all the moving pieces, especially in like in Park Life and in The Great Escape and Modern Life. Like those albums, I mean, there's just so much noise to sift through.
Yeah.
It's all purposeful. It's all very well thought out, well executed. But you have to take that all in, and that honestly is a lot of work. So, obviously, you already said the R word, so I'm going to say it again. Radiohead is that band for me where I feel replenished because it's like I'm not alone. I'm not alone. There's someone
sure.
else out there feeling and thinking the way that I am.
And I think that's why Radiohead is so much more successful, because that element, Tom York is brilliant at being able to present his musical ideas in a personal, emotional way that other people can relate to.
Yeah, right.
I think that for the exact reason I just said I love Blur, that's why they have trouble with some audiences, because they build a wall between them and the listeners.
Yeah, it's more disconnected in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's also why like 13 is such an intriguing album to me, because it really like there is some like emotional depth there that is really complex, and it's fun to dig through and try to sift through it because it's so guarded. And I think that guarded is the key word I would use to describe most of Blur's music.
It's a good way.
And in a way, honestly, it kind of, I think that it's funny that I got into Blur so much later in life, because I feel like getting a little bit of a microphone confessional here, but I feel so much more guarded or required to be guarded in my life now as a guy in my I'm almost 30 now. Like, and I almost feel like as a father, as like in the position I have at work, like I have to be more guarded in my life and not like emote as much. And that's just what is required of me as a participant in this society, right? So I think it's kind of cool that I can kind of relate to Blur a little bit more now, which makes them more accessible to me, when I really struggled with that back in college.
For sure.
I mean, it was tough for me to get. I remember you used to play Blur for me, and I would be like, this doesn't do much for me. And now it does so much more, and it's so much more of an experience to listen to. Well, after those deep words, I'd like to know from you guys out there, what is your favorite Blur album? And yes, on the last one, I asked you what was your favorite of the Modern Life, Park Life, and The Great Escape. But thinking about Blur's discography as a whole, if you had to select one album to take with you for the rest of your life, which one would it be and why? Also, give us your top 5 favorite Blur songs. We want to know. Thank you guys for your continued support and participation. Tom and I love all of your comments on our YouTube videos, your Facebook messages to us, and your emails at velocitiesofmusic@gmail.com. Your participation is what makes Velocities of Music possible, so as always, thank you for being awesome. I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
We are Velocities of Music, moving music discussion forward.